The morning after my son's funeral, the phone rang at 3:15 a.m. An airport employee said, "Sir, your son checked in for his 3 a.m. flight and left a bag with your name on it." I was completely stunned. Just hours earlier, I had watched my son's coffin being lowered into the ground. But something in that call pulled me out of the house, and I drove straight to the airport. Inside the bag were $50,000 in cash, a phone, and a handwritten note that simply read, "Dad, please watch the video." My hands trembled as I pressed the play button, because the moment the screen lit up, what I saw nearly made my heart stop. Welcome to the story. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today, your city or country. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy stories like this. Note: this is a fictional story with dramatized elements created to convey meaningful and thoughtful ideas. My son Julian had been in the ground for exactly 24 hours when the dead man called my house. The shrill, rhythmic chirp of my vintage landline sliced through the heavy, stagnant air of my bedroom at 3:15 in the morning, a sound that should have been impossible in a house currently draped in the black silk of mourning. I am Arthur Sterling, a 72-year-old retired paralegal who spent 3 decades watching the gears of justice turn from a desk in downtown Denver, and I know exactly what a lie looks like before it is even spoken. My hands, liver-spotted but steady from years of filing legal briefs, reached for the receiver. A voice on the other end, thin and apologetic, identified itself as Baggage Services from Denver International Airport. The clerk sounded young, likely working the graveyard shift, and he told me they had a bag left at Terminal B for a 3 a.m. flight to Seattle. The passenger manifest listed the owner as Julian Sterling. I felt a cold, visceral shock settle in the marrow of my bones. I told him quite clearly that it was impossible because I had watched the mahogany casket containing my son being lowered into the Colorado soil yesterday afternoon. There was a long, suffocating silence on the line. The clerk cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he insisted that a man matching Julian's ID had scanned a boarding pass at an automated kiosk and left a blue canvas bag at the counter before walking toward the exit. He never boarded. How does a man who was lowered into the Colorado soil at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday stand at a check-in kiosk at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday? The cognitive dissonance was a physical weight, pressing against my chest as I stood in the dark. I asked the boy to describe the passenger. He spoke of a tall man with an athletic build and a distinctive silver environmental consultant's ring on his right hand. My heart hammered against my ribs. That ring was a one-of-a-kind piece Julian had commissioned when he started his firm. The clerk added that the bag had a handwritten tag with my personal cell phone number and a brief note attached to the handle. This was no clerical error or a cruel prank by a stranger. It was a pre-planned, post-mortem delivery. I took a deep breath, the smell of stale grief in the hallways of my Highland Victorian home suddenly feeling like a secondary character in the room. I moved toward my study, the floorboards groaning under my weight. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was a messenger from the grave. I dressed in the shadows, moving with a surgical silence, to avoid waking my daughter-in-law Beatrix, who was sleeping in the guest wing. My mind raced through the last few weeks of Julian's life, recalling the way he had been obsessively backing up hard drives and whispering into his phone at odd hours. He had anticipated his own end. He had known the vultures were circling the estate and had staged this ghost check-in to ensure I was the one who got the evidence. I gripped my old brass keys, their cold weight a grounding reality in a world that had gone mad. I told the clerk I would be there in 40 minutes and ordered him not to let a soul touch that bag. I pulled out of the driveway and onto I-70 East, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, knowing that whatever was in that blue canvas bag would either save my life or prove I was the next one meant to die. The highway blurred beneath my wheels as I pushed my sedan toward the airport, my pulse thrumming in my ears like a second engine. I had spent half my life dissecting the logic of the living, yet here I was racing toward a rendezvous with a phantom. The fluorescent lights of the DIA baggage terminal hummed with a sterile, predatory energy that made the hair on my arms stand up as I stepped through the sliding glass doors. The terminal was an island of artificial day in the center of the dark Colorado plains, smelling of jet fuel and cold concrete. I approached the baggage services counter, where a young clerk with sunken eyes and a twitching jaw waited for me. He pushed a blue canvas bag across the scuffed linoleum, his hands trembling, as he avoided my gaze. I recognized the coarse texture of the fabric immediately. It was the gym bag Julian used for his weekend hikes. I looked at the tag, and the air left my lungs. It was Julian's handwriting, the slanted J of his signature, as familiar to me as my own face. I signed the manifest with a hand that felt like it belonged to a stranger. The clerk whispered that he just wanted the bag off his books, his voice cracking with a fear he couldn't quite name. I gripped the handle, the weight of it surprising me, and walked back to the parking structure in a state of eerie, suspended animation. I retreated to the safety of my car on level 3, locking the doors, before I even dared to exhale. The bag sat on the passenger seat like a live grenade. Why would a man who spent his life analyzing environmental toxins leave behind $50,000 in cash if he wasn't paying for a way out of a trap? My hands shook as I pulled the zipper back, revealing a war chest that no grieving widow should ever find. Inside lay a secondary passport, a thick stack of banded $100 bills totaling exactly $50,000, and a sleek smartphone. A yellow post-it note was stuck to the screen, the adhesive barely holding. Watch video first, then audio, sorry. My son, Julian Sterling, was a 43-year-old environmental consultant who could spot a toxin in a river from a mile away. Yet he never saw the one sitting across from him at the dinner table until it was too late. I powered on the device, the blue light of the smartphone illuminating my aged face in the cramped interior of the car. I found a single video file labeled "Open First." When I pressed play, the image that flickered to life shattered the last of my composure. Julian's face filled the screen, but he looked like a skeletal version of the man I had buried. He was gaunt, his forehead beaded with a feverish sweat, and his breathing was ragged and shallow. His eyes. I hadn't noticed at the funeral, but in the video Julian's eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen his own ghost. He spoke directly to the camera, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Dad, if you're seeing this, I'm already gone and the house isn't safe anymore," he said, his gaze darting to something off camera. He was recording this because he didn't think he would make it to the weekend, and the terror in his expression was a physical blow to my heart. As Julian's image flickered on the small screen, he leaned closer to the microphone and whispered the names of the people who were currently sleeping under my roof. Julian's voice on the video crackled with a desperate final urgency, the tinny audio barely rising above the hum of the car's ventilation. Hearing my son's voice describe his own murder felt like a slow-motion execution one, where I was the only witness left alive to stop the next one. As the video ended, I tapped the screen to play a secondary audio file, one Julian had time-stamped only 3 days before he collapsed. The tinny digital distortion of my own kitchen filled the car. I heard the clink of porcelain and the low conspiratorial murmur of voices I had trusted for years. Beatrix was there, her voice stripped of its public velvet, discussing Step 2 with clinical detachedness. They were talking about me. They were discussing the legal incapacitation of Arthur Sterling, as if I were a line item in a bankruptcy filing. Beatrix laughed a sharp, cold sound about how Julian's heavy sleep had made it easy to forge the banking app transfers. Then came the voice of 19-year-old Marigold Thorne, Beatrix's daughter from a previous life, who hovered in the corners of my house like a ghost, her eyes glued to a smartphone that was doing far more damage than I ever imagined. Marigold was the one tracking my supposed memory lapses, documenting every time I misplaced my glasses as evidence of cognitive decline. If the old man draws up a new power of attorney before we move the deeds, the whole thing collapses, Beatrix warned. "He won't," Marigold replied. He can barely remember where he puts his reading glasses lately. Their voices were like termites chewing through the structural integrity of the only life I had left. I sat in the dark of the DIA parking structure, my lungs seizing at the depth of the sociopathy recorded on that small device. The $50,000 in the bag wasn't just cash. It was a war chest Julian had clawed back from the vultures, a resource hidden from the predators under my roof. I put the car in gear and drove back toward the Highland District, my paralegal brain automatically categorizing every sentence as a piece of admissible evidence. I parked 2 blocks away from the Victorian estate I had built in 1989, a house I refused to die as a guest in. I took several deep breaths of the cold, damp Denver sunrise to steady my hands, then tucked the smartphone and the cash into the car's hidden emergency compartment. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone who is mentally measuring your casket while they offer you a cup of tea? I walked into the foyer, and the smell of brewing coffee and lavender detergent hit me like a physical blow. Beatrix Thorne, my 42-year-old daughter-in-law, stood by the stairs wearing Julian's old college hoodie, the scratchy wool a mockery of the man who once owned it. She was clutching a damp tissue, the rhythmic wet sound of her dabbing her eyes punctuating her performative worry. "Arthur, where have you been?" she cried, her face a mask of frantic grief. I woke up, and the car was gone. I was so scared something had happened to you too. I realized then that her worry was a trap. She was already documenting my wandering for the doctors she likely had on standby. She reached out to touch my arm with a hand that had likely signed the documents to end my son's life, and I had to fight every instinct I possessed not to recoil in horror. The heavy, oppressive silence of a breakfast table shared with a killer is a weight that few can truly comprehend. Every clink of a spoon against a ceramic bowl felt like a gavel striking, and the smell of the French press coffee Beatrix had poured for me was tainted by the memory of the audio I'd played in the dark. I didn't wait for the coffee to brew or for Beatrix to finish her choreographed sob story about the nightmares she'd had during my brief absence. I told her I had an early doctor's appointment that I'd forgotten to mention, ignored her offer to drive me, and grabbed my coat. I drove toward the only man in Denver who still owed me a favor. My hands vibrated against the steering wheel as I maneuvered my sedan through the thickening morning traffic, heading away from the Highland estate toward the glass and steel of downtown. I kept my eyes on the mirrors, searching for a familiar black SUV or a trailing sedan, my mind a rapid-fire checklist of legal protocols. The $50,000 in the hidden compartment felt like a lead weight beneath my seat. I knew the widow would soon realize the blue canvas bag at the airport was gone, and once that happened, the hunt would move from the shadows into the light. 35 years of paralegal work. I'd seen this movie before, but never with my own life as the script. I reached the glass tower of my old firm, the bright clinical glare of the downtown Denver skyline reflecting off the windows with a blinding intensity. Thane Garrison, a 45-year-old defense attorney with a posture like a sharpened blade, stood behind his mahogany desk. His expensive suit, a far cry from the hungry intern I'd mentored 20 years ago. The office smelled of expensive leather and old paper, a comforting scent of order that I desperately needed. "I'm not here as a visitor, Thane," I said as I closed the door. "I'm here as a client. And I need a vault." I laid it all out for him. Julian's staged message, the escape fund, and the recording of Beatrix and Marigold. Thane's expression hardened from professional warmth to a grim, predatory focus. He looked at the smartphone I'd recovered with a lawyer's cold eye. "Arthur, if what is on this phone is real, you aren't just dealing with greedy relatives," he whispered. "You're living with a professional hit squad." He mentioned the initials I'd seen in the emails. Thane revealed that the HV Julian had flagged was almost certainly Hunter Volos, an attorney notorious for winning high-value probate cases through aggressive and often unethical means. What do you call a legal system that allows a signature to be more lethal than a bullet? I formally retained Thane, handing over a portion of the cash as a retainer. We moved into the firm's vault room, the heavy mechanical thud of the door sealing out the world. I placed the smartphone and the airport documents into his fireproof safe. They think I am a confused old man, I told him, the restrained anger finally bleeding into my voice. Let them keep thinking that until the moment the gavel falls. Thane warned me that we needed a psychiatric evaluation of our own, one they couldn't touch. Because the Step 2 physicians mentioned in the recording were likely specialists who had worked with Volos to bury clients before. As the vault door clicked shut, Thane looked at me with a pity that burned worse than the betrayal, and I knew the next time I saw him, it would be in a room where only one of us was expected to survive. The return to the quiet, haunted rooms of the Highland house felt like stepping back into a cold tomb that refused to be sealed. I navigated the familiar hallways with a newfound vigilance, every shadow a potential witness to my movements. I slipped into Julian's study, locking the heavy oak door behind me. The room still held the dry, stale smell of old printer toner and the lingering ghost of my son's preferred cedarwood incense. I felt a strategic fortification in my chest, a cold steel replacing the hollow grief. There is a specific kind of sickness that settles in your gut when you realize you've been subsidizing your own son's replacement. I sat before his computer, the blue, hypnotic flicker of the monitor reflecting in my glasses as I accessed the local drive Julian had obsessively backed up before his final collapse. I began a forensic audit of his credit card statements, my pen scratching against a legal pad, as I cross-referenced the last 6 months of charges. Julian was a man of simple tastes. He preferred a grilled cheese sandwich to a 5-course meal. Yet the statements were littered with high-end grocery deliveries from artisanal markets he'd once mocked as overpriced status symbols. I found a charge for $400 at a luxury hardware store for a smart lock system Julian never installed. At least I hadn't seen it in the common areas. Then the realization hit me like a physical blow. Beatrix Thorne moved through Julian's bank accounts like a virus through an open wound, quiet, efficient, and utterly lethal. My son's money had been used to pay for the very security upgrades that now restricted my access to certain wings of my own home. My anger, usually a restrained and quiet thing, began to simmer toward a searing resentment. I dug deeper into the digital ledger until I found a recurring monthly charge of $2,400 to a property management firm in Capitol Hill. The invoices were cleverly disguised as business storage, but the address was a residential high-rise miles away from our Highland Victorian. I cross-referenced the dates with my own mental calendar. Every payment coincided perfectly with the nights Beatrix claimed she was in Boulder, visiting a sister who didn't actually exist. She didn't have a sister in Boulder. She had a ghost in Capitol Hill. Every steak, every bottle of wine Julian paid for was fuel for the man who was killing him. Greed isn't just a sin. In this house, it was a weapon system designed to erase a man while he was still breathing. I stood up, my knees popping in the silence, and began a physical search of the desk. I ran my fingers along the mahogany grain until I found a spare key taped to the underside of the bottom drawer. It was silver heavy and cold, with a small tag labeled with an address on Emerson Street. Julian knew. He hadn't just suspected the affair. The existence of this key suggested he had already been to that apartment. He was waiting for the right moment to strike, but his heart had given out before he could finish the play. I looked at the small silver key in my palm and realized that the counselor Vance Prescott wasn't just visiting the house. He was already living a second life on my son's dime. Julian had likely left something at that apartment for me to find a final piece of evidence hidden in the lion's den. The sound of a door handle rattling against the locked study door was the first warning shot in a war Beatrix didn't know I was finally fighting. I pocketed the silver key just as the study door swung open, and I found myself staring at a woman holding a stack of cardboard boxes meant to erase my son's existence. Beatrix stood there, caught off guard by my presence in the middle of Julian's sanctuary. She blinked her face quickly, smoothing into that practiced mask of weary compassion she had worn since the funeral. "Arthur, you shouldn't be in here," she said, her voice a soft, manipulative coo. "It's far too much for you right now." I watched her eyes dart toward the desk I had just been pillaging. She was holding 6 flat-packed cardboard boxes, the dry cardboard smell of the new material filling the hallway. I'm just helping Arthur. I'm clearing out the clutter. It's what Julian would have wanted for us to move forward. She began to unfold the first one with a clinical efficiency that made my blood run cold. She wasn't grieving. She was purging. Every file, every personal belonging, every scrap of paper that might hold a clue to her betrayal was destined for a box labeled Donate. How many boxes does it take to pack away a human life? Apparently, she thought she could fit Julian into 6. The explosive rage I felt was a physical heat in my throat. But I forced it down into the same dark place where I kept the knowledge of her lover. I adopted a mask of my own, the face of a compliant, slightly confused old man. "I'll take them, Beatrix," I said, my voice intentionally thin. "I need something to do with my hands. If I sit still too long, the house gets too quiet." She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the cardboard. "Are you sure I already scheduled a pickup for the boxes?" She revealed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Marigold's friend is coming by tonight to haul it all away. I had only hours. If I didn't act now, the evidence would be in a landfill or a thrift store by dawn." I insisted gently but firmly, taking the heavy stack from her arms. "I want to go through them slowly," I told her, "for the sake of nostalgia." She couldn't find a logical reason to refuse me without appearing suspicious, so she stepped aside. I carried the boxes down to my garage workshop, the one place in the estate she avoided because of the smell of grease and old metal. I moved them with a rhythmic heavy thud, stacking them against the back wall behind my vintage workbench. I turned the handle of the heavy industrial deadbolt and felt the metallic snap as the cylinder turned. The deadbolt clicked. It was the sweetest sound I'd heard in years. I stepped out into the cold, late-afternoon Denver wind that whipped through the open garage door and looked back toward the house. Beatrix was standing at the kitchen window, the glare of the interior light reflecting off her pale face. Her expression had shifted. The false grief was gone, replaced by a narrow-eyed calculation. I met her gaze through the glass and let a small, pleasant smile touch my lips. The kind of smile that didn't reach my eyes. The kind that told her the clutter wasn't the only thing being moved off the board. For the first time, she saw me not as a victim, but as a player. The silence of the garage at midnight was a heavy physical thing, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the 1962 Illinois Bun Special Julian had loved so much. I sat on my workbench stool, the silver key to the secret apartment resting like a cold coin in my pocket, while the 6 cardboard boxes stood before me like a jury. I had locked the industrial deadbolt, sealing myself into a world that smelled of machine oil and the fine, dry dust of old paper. I knew Beatrix was likely watching from the kitchen window, but in here, surrounded by my lathes and hand tools, I was the expert in my own domain. I began to peel back the tape on the first box, realizing quickly that Julian hadn't been cleaning his office in his final weeks. He had been archiving his life. These weren't remnants of a cluttered career, but a meticulously organized history. Beneath layers of mundane tax returns and insurance policies, I found what I was looking for. Julian had buried a folder labeled Correspondence 2023 to 2024 at the very bottom of a crate filled with heavy, outdated college textbooks. It was a dead man's switch, hidden under the weight of geology and physics. "You weren't just clearing the decks, Julian," I whispered to the empty room. "You were building a record." I felt a surge of analytical focus as I pulled the first stack of papers from the folder, desperate to see the truth that Beatrix had tried to send to a landfill. Click. The world vanished. In the Highland darkness isn't an accident, it's a message. The hum of the fluorescent shop lights died instantly, and the sudden absolute silence that followed was deafening. I didn't move. I remained perfectly still on my stool, listening to the house. I knew that sound, the distinct metallic snap of the exterior breaker panel being flipped. Someone was outside in the dark, trying to blind me. Nice try, Beatrix, I thought, but I built this breaker box 20 years ago, and I don't need the sun to read a lie. I reached into the top drawer of my workbench and retrieved the heavy-duty LED flashlight I'd kept in the same spot for over 2 decades. The blinding white beam sliced through the dark, illuminating the papers in my hand with a clinical, unforgiving glare. I opened a sealed envelope and found a printed email thread between Beatrix and a recipient with the initials HV. The date at the top of the page stopped my heart, December 2023. This was 3 full months before Julian's symptoms had even appeared. They were already discussing a revised timeline for the property transfer and the urgent need for Arthur Sterling to be medically managed before the spring thaw. I felt an icy clarity wash over me as I realized my son's death wasn't a tragedy. It was a scheduled event on a corporate calendar. They were measuring the drapes for my house while Julian was still breathing. How do you sleep at night knowing the person next to you has already marked your expiration date on a calendar? They didn't just kill him. They scheduled him. The beam of my flashlight hit the final line of the December email, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt a rage so pure, it made my hands stop shaking. AS. Needs to be neutralized by April. The kitchen light was already on when I walked back into the house, but the warmth I usually felt in my home was gone. I kept the December email folded small in my pocket, the ink feeling like a live wire against my thigh, as I walked back into a kitchen that smelled of lavender and deception. Beatrix was standing by the sink, her silhouette framed by the window that overlooked the very garage where she had just tried to bury me in darkness. She didn't jump or act startled. She merely turned with a practiced grace that set my teeth on edge. "The breaker tripped again, Arthur." She said, her voice a smooth, comforting hum. "It is that old Victorian wiring. I have told you we should have it looked at." She looked at me with an expression of mild concern, but her hands were steady as she dried a plate too steady for a woman whose father-in-law had been stuck in a dark workshop. "It didn't trip, Beatrix." I replied, my voice holding a gravelly edge I didn't bother to hide. "It was flipped." "There is a difference." I watched for a flicker of guilt, but she just sighed and walked toward the pantry. "You look so tired lately, Arthur," she whispered. "All this stress is making you imagine things. Let me make you a calming herbal tea. It is a special blend Julian used to like. It will help you sleep." She pulled a specific tin from the back of the shelf, one I didn't recognize. The predatory nature of the offering was unmistakable. She was using Julian's memory as a delivery vehicle for the very substance that had likely stopped his heart. How do you tell the difference between the onset of old age and a calculated chemical erasure of your soul? I watched the steam rise from the porcelain cup she set before me. I realized this was the neutralization beginning in earnest. But to keep the upper hand, I had to play the role of the frail, aging man. "You are very thoughtful tonight, Beatrix," I said, reaching for the handle. Almost too thoughtful. I took a small, cautious sip. The tea was cloyingly sweet, drowning in honey. But beneath the sugar, I detected a sharp, metallic bitterness that coated my tongue like copper. It was unmistakable. Copper. My mouth tasted like I had been sucking on a handful of pennies. Within minutes, a heavy artificial fog began to settle over my mind. The buzzing heavy sound of the refrigerator hum in the silent house grew into a deafening roar. My vision blurred at the edges, the kitchen floor tilting like a ship at sea. I remembered a probate case from 2018 where a daughter had used concentrated sedatives to silence her father. That copper taint was the calling card of a specific high-grade tranquilizer. The room was getting a bit soft around the edges. I muttered my own voice, sounding like a distant, watery echo. "Just lean back, Arthur." Beatrix replied, her face hovering above me like a pale, inquisitive moon. "Let the sleep come." The ceramic cup felt like it weighed 50 pounds as it slipped from my numb fingers. As the darkness rushed in to claim me, I saw Beatrix tilt her head, watching me fail with the clinical curiosity of a scientist observing a lab rat to see how long it takes for the heart to quit. The sound of the tea splashing onto the tile floor was the loudest thing I'd ever heard a liquid alarm bell in the middle of my own living room. Adrenaline is the only antidote for a sedative, and I used every drop of it to keep my eyes from rolling back into my head as I felt the kitchen floor rush up to meet me. I collapsed with a deliberate jarring force, knocking my chair backward. The cold, unforgiving hardness of the kitchen tile bit into my shoulder, but I didn't flinch. I lay there feigning a semi-conscious state, watching through slit eyes as Beatrix moved. She didn't scream. She took a single sharp breath and then hovered over me, her face a mask of simulated terror. "Arthur, oh God, you've had a fall!" she cried, her voice high and frantic. "Don't move, just breathe." I groaned, playing the part of the broken old man. So dizzy, I whispered, my tongue feeling like a heavy slab of lead. "Everything is spinning, Beatrix." As she reached for the telephone, I moved. My hand, hidden beneath the folds of my heavy wool cardigan, palmed a sterile specimen jar I had tucked into my waistband hours ago. While she was distracted by the dial tone, I pressed the cuff of my sleeve into the dark puddle of herbal tea and floor cleaner. The wool soaked it up greedily. I felt the frantic thudding sound of my heart against my ribs, a hammer against an anvil, but I didn't stop until I knew I had enough. She helped me up, her touch clinical and cold. She wanted me on the sofa, buried in cushions, where she could watch me fade, but I insisted on the garage. "I need my tools, Beatrix," I slurred, leaning heavily on her. "The watches, they make the room stop spinning." The sharp, stinging cold of the Denver air hit me as we crossed the threshold to the workshop, a shock that helped clear the chemical fog. "You're not well, Arthur," she warned, but she let me go. Once the heavy door was locked, the adrenaline peaked. I stripped off the cardigan, a thick navy blue knit that had been Julian's final birthday gift to me. I realized with a start that my son's gift was literally saving my life for the second time today. Is it still called a home if you have to treat every doorway like a tripwire and every cup of tea like a death warrant? I wrung the poisoned liquid from the wool sleeve into the specimen jar, watching the amber droplets fall with a grim sense of triumph. I sealed it tight and shoved it into the hollow, oily base of my heavy industrial lathe. No one would think to look there. I turned to the last of Julian's boxes, my hands finally steady. Beneath a stack of old magazines, I found a printout of an email chain between Julian and a local cardiologist. Julian had been describing the same metallic taste and heavy heart I had just experienced. Julian didn't die of a broken heart. He died of a broken trust. He had been documenting his own slow poisoning, noting that he suspected dietary changes were being forced upon him. "You weren't guessing, Julian." I whispered, the paper trembling in my hand. "You had the evidence. You just ran out of time." I shoved the cardiologist's emails into the waistband of my trousers. Knowing that as long as that jar was hidden in the lathe, I held a piece of the puzzle that Beatrix thought she'd already scrubbed clean from the kitchen floor. The sunrise over Denver was a pale, sickly yellow, reflecting the poison still circulating in my veins as I sat in the garage workshop, my phone pressed to my ear. How do you sit across from a woman who is feeding you a slow death and ask her to pass the salt without your hand shaking? I was waiting for the independent lab's verdict on the tea sample I'd wrung from my cardigan. The technician's voice was a metallic clinical drone over the speaker, lacking any human warmth. "Mr. Sterling, the benzodiazepine concentration in that sample measured 15 milligrams per serving." He said, his words clipped and precise. "That's 6 times the standard therapeutic dose. These levels aren't designed to calm, they're designed to incapacitate." I felt a surge of grim validation. This specific sedative was the perfect tool for the Step 2 doctors Julian had warned me about. It mimics the symptoms of dementia so perfectly that the medical board wouldn't blink twice when they signed the commitment papers. I recorded every word of the call, saving the file as the first forensic pillar of a case that would eventually dismantle Beatrix's world. "It is exactly what I needed to hear," I told him, my voice flat. "Send the official report to my attorney, Thane Garrison, immediately. I also need a certified copy for the district attorney's office." The lab would bill me $1,800 for the expedited analysis and chain of custody documentation, but it was worth every cent. I tucked the cardiologist's emails deeper into my waistband and stepped out of the garage, preparing for the most dangerous performance of my life. 15 milligrams. She was turning my brain into a mush of forgotten names and lost hours or so, she thought. Every meal in the house was now a potential tripwire. At lunchtime, I sat in the kitchen as Beatrix placed a bowl of tomato soup in front of me. The sickly, sweet smell of the broth, likely laced with the same metallic-tasting toxin, made my stomach turn. "You've barely touched your soup, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. "It's Julian's favorite recipe." I leaned into the roll, letting my hand tremble slightly as I picked up the spoon. "My appetite isn't what it used to be, Beatrix. Old age, I suppose." I made a show of blowing on the liquid, then waited for her to turn toward the refrigerator. In that 3-second window, I poured the soup into a small, sealable plastic bag I'd hidden in my lap and slipped it into my pocket. I survived on a secret cache of sealed protein bars and bottled water hidden behind the vintage clock movements in my workshop. The quiet crinkle of a hidden wrapper was the only sound of my survival. The doorbell didn't just ring. It announced an invasion, a sharp two-tone chime that signaled the arrival of the man who had been paying his rent with my son's blood. I moved away from the kitchen doorway, keeping my expression flat and vacant, as Beatrix hurried toward the foyer. The man who called himself a family friend, Vance Prescott, was a 45-year-old with the polished teeth of a salesman and the shifting eyes of a man who had already spent his life looking for the nearest exit. He was immaculate, draped in a charcoal wool suit that whispered of wealth, but the air around him was heavy with the sharp, expensive scent of sandalwood cologne, a smell that tried too hard to mask the rot of a predator. Beatrix introduced him as a grief counselor, her voice pitched in that high, breathless tone she used when she was performing for an audience. I stood at the top of the stairs, my palms cold against the damp wallpaper of the hallway, playing the part of the fragile, fading patriarch. "Arthur," she said, gesturing for me to descend. "This is Vance. He is here to help us navigate the administrative side of our loss." Vance reached out a hand, his grip firm and dry. "I've heard so much about your brilliant career, Mr. Sterling," he said, his smile never reaching those cold, calculating eyes. "It's a shame to see such a mind under a cloud." I knew then that his expertise wasn't in grief. I recognized the name from a disbarred financial advisor list I'd seen years ago, a specialist in predatory estate transfers who had lost his license for borrowing from the elderly. He touched the walnut wainscoting, like he was already planning where to hang his own coat. It made my skin crawl. While Beatrix went to the kitchen to prepare coffee, Vance began a slow, predatory circuit of the living room. He didn't look at the photos of Julian or the family heirlooms with sentiment. He appraised them like an insurance adjuster. He let his fingers trail over the Victorian moldings, his eyes lingering on the mahogany study door and the exact spot where the wall safe was hidden behind the landscape painting. I followed him with a hollow gaze, letting my mouth hang slightly open, as if I were struggling to keep up with the conversation. "This is quite a lot of house for an old man to manage alone, don't you think?" he asked, his voice a smooth, oily purr. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice a thin rasp. "I remember where every nail was driven, Mr. Prescott. Is there anything more dangerous than a man with a suit that fits perfectly and a conscience that doesn't exist?" I feigned a sudden need for the restroom, doubling back through the shadows of the hallway once I was out of their sight. The heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock masked my footsteps. From the dark corner near the pantry, I watched the kitchen. Beatrix and Vance were standing close, too close. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a familiar possessive gesture that stripped away every lie of professional distance. "How much longer?" B. Vance whispered, the bitterness of the coffee steam rising between them. "The doctors are getting impatient." "Soon," she replied, her face a mask of cold iron. "He is already stumbling. Just hold your breath a little longer." I pulled back into the darkness of the hall, just as Vance turned his head, But it wasn't his eyes that caught me. It was the silver ring on his pinky finger, the exact twin to the one Julian had left in the airport bag. I sat in the dark of my study that night, the silver key Julian left me feeling like a block of ice against my chest. Secrets have a way of rotting from the inside out, and the one I was about to uncover didn't just explain Julian's death, it redefined the last 20 years of a lie. I had to know about the ring. I had to know why a man who claimed to be a stranger wore a signature piece belonging to my son. I drove to a nondescript office building on the edge of downtown Denver, the kind of place where the directory names change every 6 months. Claude Wilson, a 55-year-old private investigator with the lean build of a distance runner and eyes that seemed to record every shadow in the room, sat behind a desk that held nothing but a laptop and a cold cup of black coffee. The office was thick with the hum of a server rack tucked in the corner and the faint, stale smell of cigarette smoke clinging to old case files. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "That ring on Vance Prescott's finger isn't just jewelry, Claude," I said, leaning over the desk. "It's a signature." I watched as he began to work his fingers dancing across the keys with a clinical speed. "He didn't go by Prescott in Illinois." Claude muttered, his eyes never leaving the screen. "He's a high-level fraudster who specialized in predatory companionship for wealthy estates." My paralegal mind started connecting the dots of a life spent in the shadows. Claude flipped the laptop around to show me a pixelated blue-glow gym surveillance photo from 8 months ago. It was a weight room in Aurora. Beatrix and Vance were standing by a rack of dumbbells talking with the easy familiarity of long-time lovers. Gym records. 8 months of heavy lifting and heavier lies. They were training for a murder, like it was a marathon. They didn't meet at a support group after Julian died. I realized the cold coffee in my hand, tasting bitter and forgotten. They met in a weight room to plan a funeral. 8 months. They had been circling my son like vultures for 8 months, waiting for the toxin to do its slow, quiet work. I felt a surge of icy clarity. Their reconnection wasn't a coincidence. It was the catalyst for the entire collapse of my family. But Claude wasn't finished. He pulled up a scanned document, the crinkle of a 20-year-old birth certificate modification, practically audible in the silence of the room. "How do you protect a house when the enemy has already planted their own family tree in the middle of your living room?" Claude pointed to the original biological father listed on the record before. "The car accident story was fabricated. It was Vance. He's not her counselor, Arthur. He's her father." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. They didn't just bring a lover into my house. They brought a bloodline. Marigold wasn't a quiet witness or a victim of circumstances. She was the product of a criminal partnership that predated her own birth. I looked at the birth certificate in Claude's hand and felt the Highland air turn to ash in my lungs, realizing that Marigold wasn't just a quiet witness. She was the heir to the very empire they were building on my son's grave. The entire Thorne presence in my home was a multi-generational criminal infiltration designed to strip the sterling legacy bare, and my son was just the obstacle they had finally cleared away. The drive back from Claude's office had been a blur of neon signs and the crushing weight of a family name being erased. But by morning, that horror had condensed into a cold, analytical resolve. I watched the steam rise from my black coffee in the booth of a local Denver diner, but my mind was focused on a different kind of vapor, the digital trail of money that had vanished into thin air while my son was still gasping for his last breath. The air in the diner smelled of burnt coffee and maple syrup, a domestic scent that felt like a mockery of the clinical betrayal I was currently dissecting. Claude Wilson sat across from me, his expression unreadable as the distant rhythmic clatter of dishes echoed from the kitchen. He slid a manila folder across the sticky, laminated surface of the table, the coarse paper of the forensic report feeling abrasive against my fingertips. This contained the logs from the insurance company's portal, the very heart of the theft. Claude pointed to a specific timestamp, 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. I remember that night. Julian had been in a medically induced, heavy sleep after one of Beatrix's calming teas. The logs showed a $220,000 life insurance policy. Julian's entire death benefit had its beneficiary changed from me to Beatrix Thorne, while he lay oblivious in his bed. They didn't use the home Wi-Fi. Arthur Claude said, his voice low. They weren't that sloppy. The IP address used for the transaction didn't match our house router. It was a mobile hotspot registered to a device I didn't recognize. A mobile hotspot. They were trying to create a ghost in the machine, a digital shadow that would bypass my scrutiny. A MAC address. A digital DNA strand left at the scene of a life-shattering crime. Claude explained that every device leaves a unique fingerprint on a network, and he had spent the night cross-referencing these logs with the school network Marigold uses for her community college classes. The MAC address matched perfectly with the laptop Julian had bought her for her 18th birthday. I felt a wave of disgust and betrayal wash over me, more bitter than the cold coffee in my mug. She didn't just witness the crime, Claude. She coded it. Julian had bought her that laptop to help with her future, and she had used the gift of her victim to facilitate his absolute ruin. How do you reconcile the image of a girl doing homework with the reality of a predator draining a dying man's bank account? The report showed a secondary trail of $47,800 drained from Julian's personal savings account in 13 separate transfers over 6 weeks. These funds were transferred in small increments to a neobank account in the Cayman Islands, a destination Claude identified as a favorite for Vance Prescott's previous victims. The $220,000 insurance policy was the crown jewel of their scheme, the final payout they were waiting for, once I was safely declared incompetent or dead. The property line between my estate and the Gable house was marked by a row of overgrown hydrangeas, their heavy blue heads nodding in the morning breeze. I spent 30 years in courtrooms learning that the most devastating evidence often comes from the person who has nothing better to do than watch the street from their kitchen window. I ventured into the garden, the smell of damp earth and blooming hydrangeas filling the air, and began the rhythmic snip-snip of my garden shears. My neighbor Mrs. Gable was a 75-year-old widow who treated her lace curtains like a sniper's nest, possessing a memory for license plates and late-night visitors that would put a precinct detective to shame. I saw her peering through her screen door and offered a slow, weary wave. I played the role of the grieving, slightly forgetful old man leaning against the fence, as if I needed the support. I am just trying to remember who Julian had over to help with the plumbing back in January, Mrs. Gable. I said, my voice thin and wavering. My mind is like a sieve lately. She stepped onto her porch, her scratchy, high-pitched warble cutting through the quiet morning. Plumbing Arthur, that man wasn't wearing overalls. He was wearing Italian leather and driving a black Mercedes. I felt a surge of calculating curiosity. She leaned in closer, revealing that the grief counselor Vance had his own key to my back garden gate provided by Marigold months before Julian died. Never underestimate a neighbor with a set of binoculars and a resentment for local noise ordinances. Mrs. Gable recounted how Vance would park a block away and walk through the alley every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork. Marigold would meet him at the gate while Julian was working those grueling late shifts at the consultancy. Most importantly, she described seeing Vance hand over small, amber-colored pharmacy bottles to Beatrix in the driveway when they thought the neighborhood was asleep. My stomach turned with a nauseating confirmation. Amber bottles, I asked, keeping my tone casual despite the cold weight of the smartphone against my chest. You are sure they weren't just groceries? She scoffed, the glint of the sun off Vance's remembered Mercedes seemingly reflected in her eyes. I know a pill bottle when I see one, Arthur. They were careful, but not careful enough. I subtly activated the recording app on my phone, ensuring her scratchy testimony was captured for Thane. Amber bottles. The delivery of death handed over like a neighborly cup of sugar. She confirmed the dates, and I realized they aligned perfectly with the nights Julian's heart palpitations were recorded as being at their worst. "You have a sharp eye, Mrs. Gable," I said, managing a small, grim smile of vindicated satisfaction. "You should have been a detective." She chuckled, adjusting her apron. "In this neighborhood, Arthur, you have to be. People think old ladies are invisible." I thanked her and walked back toward my house, the phone in my pocket, containing a confession of a conspiracy that stretched back to the first frost of winter. The air felt colder as I stepped onto the porch. I saw the bank manager's car pulling into my driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel with a frantic urgency. He looked through the windshield at me, and I knew that the digital theft Claude uncovered was finally colliding with the physical reality of my son's estate. The bank manager, a man usually defined by his ironed shirts and professional calm, was sweating through his suit jacket as he slammed his car door shut in my driveway. Mr. Henderson, the branch manager of First National Bank for 15 years, was a man of strict ledger lines and starched collars who currently looked like he'd been chased through a Denver alleyway by a ghost. He stood on the hot asphalt, the damp heat of a Denver noon making the air shimmer around his frantic silhouette. "Arthur, we have a problem." He stammered, his eyes darting toward the front door of my house as if expecting a siege. I maintained my posture of vigilant triumph, leaning against the porch railing. "She was at the bank an hour ago," Henderson continued. "Beatrix, she presented a durable power of attorney document claiming you were indisposed, and Julian's safe deposit box needed an immediate inventory for the estate." I felt a cold surge of satisfaction because I had flagged the accounts and provided Henderson with a copy of my valid ID only 48 hours prior. The security protocol had held firm. "She was very insistent, Arthur. She said you were having a difficult morning and couldn't leave the house." I offered him a thin, wolfish smile. "I'm having a wonderful morning, Henderson. I was just pruning my roses and recording the testimony of the neighbors." We moved onto the shaded porch where Henderson pulled a sharp, synthetic-smelling printout from his briefcase. It was a digital photo of the document Beatrix had presented. I looked down and felt my breath hitch. My signature. Loops and tails I've drawn for 50 years stolen and used to sign my own death warrant. The forgery was terrifyingly accurate, but my analytical eye caught the specific legal phrasing. It was the exact Step 2 document Julian's airport recording had warned me about. "That's my name, Henderson, but that's not my hand," I whispered. "She's getting bold." I looked closer at the bottom of the page. The document had been notarized by a clerk at Hunter Volos's firm. The legal and criminal conspiracy were no longer just parallel lines. They had intersected in black ink. "We've locked vault access to in-person only for you." Henderson said, his finger tapping rhythmically on the paper, but she didn't look like she was going to stop. I accompanied him to his car, where the smell of hot asphalt mixed with cheap air freshener. He pulled up the branch's exterior security feed on a tablet. I watched the grainy, pixelated flicker of the footage. Beatrix was exiting the bank, but she wasn't crying or playing the shattered widow. She walked to her car with a stiff, predatory gait, her face a mask of cold fury. As she reached her vehicle, she stopped and looked directly into the lens of the security camera. She smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was a signal of recognition. Have you ever seen a predator realize the prey is watching them back? It doesn't make them run. It makes them hungry. She knew the heist had failed, and she was shifting her strategy. "Look at her eyes," Henderson muttered. "That's not a grieving widow." "No," I replied, my voice like gravel. "That's a hunter who just realized the trap didn't spring." As the video looped, I realized Beatrix wasn't just angry that she couldn't get into the box. She was checking her watch, counting down the minutes until the senior wellness board arrived at my front door. The black SUV didn't just pull up to the curb. It loomed there like a hearse waiting for a body that was still very much alive and armed with 30 years of legal precedence. I watched it from the window of my study, my pulse steady, despite the high-tension hum vibrating through the house. I had seen Beatrix checking her watch for the last hour, her movements jerky and anxious. When the heavy, ominous thud of the front door being opened echoed through the foyer, I didn't get up. I remained seated in my wingback chair in the living room, bathed in the aggressive white light of the Denver afternoon. Two men stepped into my home, draped in clinical white coats that smelled too strongly of fresh starch. They wore tactical-looking lanyards with plastic badges that looked impressive to the untrained eye. Beatrix opened the door immediately, her face already twisted into a mask of tearful relief. "Oh, thank God you are here!" she cried, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of a woman at her wit's end. He has been so confused, wandering at all hours. I watched the choreographed entry with a cold, analytical eye. "Mr. Sterling," one of them said, stepping into my personal space with a practiced predatory ease, "we have received an urgent concern regarding your cognitive stability and safety. We are part of the Senior Wellness Board." The suffocating tension in the room was thick enough to taste, but I didn't blink. They used soft, condescending tones, launching into a barrage of orientation questions designed to trip up a tired mind. "Arthur, do you know what year it is? Do you know who the president is?" I looked past them, noting how they scanned the room, their eyes lingering on the silver service and the antique clock, rather than my pupils. Doctors. They had the bedside manner of a debt collector and the eyes of a shark. I knew exactly who they were. My research had shown that these men weren't medical professionals. They were low-level employees from a private security firm owned by a shell company Julian had been investigating before he died. I finally spoke, my voice a dry, level rasp that cut through their rehearsed concern. "I know that your Colorado Medical Board certification isn't hanging on your lanyard, doctor," I said. "I also know that your firm's insurance doesn't cover felony impersonation." They stiffened, the younger one reaching into a pocket to produce a dry, papery transport form. It was a fraudulent attempt to take me for observation. I stood up, my taller frame casting a shadow over their paperwork, and I presented my own manila folder. I demanded to see their court-ordered subpoena and the specific NRS statutes that grant a private security firm authority over a citizen in his own home. What is more satisfying than watching a bully realize his victim is the one holding the leash? I informed them that if they touched me without a warrant signed by a Denver County judge, I would have them charged with kidnapping before they hit the driveway. I then pointed to the grandfather clock, revealing the lens of the camera I'd hidden there to record their illegal attempt to bypass due process. The men began a frantic, disorganized retreat, the younger one nearly tripping over the rug. "We must have the wrong paperwork," the lead one muttered. "We will be back." The sound of gravel spraying echoed through the house as their SUV fled. Beatrix turned to me, the mask of the grieving widow finally shattered into a jagged edge of pure, unadulterated hatred. The camera felt like a live grenade in my pocket as I descended back into the house, but for now, I was still the only one who knew it was armed. I didn't give Beatrix time to find her voice. I turned my back on her hatred and climbed the stairs toward the one part of the house where the dust still held the truth. The hallway was silent, the air heavy with the aftermath of the failed evaluation, but I moved with a poignant determination. I reached up and pulled down the heavy wooden ladder in the hallway ceiling, the rhythmic metallic creak echoing like a warning through the Highland house. I climbed into the suffocating dry heat of the attic, where the smell of old cedar and undisturbed dust lunged at my throat. I maneuvered past stacks of holiday decorations and Julian's old baseball gear, my eyes stinging as sweat began to drip into them. I felt a magnetic pull toward a specific back corner, the place where Julian used to hide his treasures as a boy. "You always went high when the world got low, didn't you, Julian?" I whispered, my voice lost in the rafters. I began to search my hands, brushing against forgotten memories, until I found a set of vintage encyclopedias. Tucked inside the hollowed-out A volume, I found a small, high-end Nikon digital camera. The device gave a cheerful digital beep as it powered on fully charged, as if Julian knew I would be coming for it today. I sat on an old steamer trunk and began to scroll through the playback, my breath hitching in the stagnant air. Julian wasn't just a victim. He was a silent investigator documenting the destruction of his own life. Encyclopedias. The A volume held the evidence of his adultery. The camera contained dozens of time-stamped photos of Beatrix's car parked outside a motel in Lakewood, often accompanied by Vance Prescott's black Mercedes. My son had used his professional environmental monitoring skills to track her movements without her ever suspecting. I saw one specific photo of them sitting on a park bench, looking at a set of blueprints for the Highland estate. Lakewood. That is where she said she was taking those grief walks to clear her head. In reality, they were redesigning my house while my son was still dying. How do you keep your hands steady when you're looking at the blueprints of your own dispossession? It was clear they had been planning this since at least January. Proving the legal theft was a multi-month project, not a reaction to Julian's sudden passing. The cold, surgical fury I felt made the sweltering attic feel like an icebox. They had sat in that motel room, likely paid for with Julian's credit cards, and mapped out how to erase us both. I zoomed in on the final photo, a high-resolution shot taken from across the motel parking lot. My heart stopped as I saw what Vance was holding in his other hand, as he leaned through the driver's side window of Beatrix's car. It was a small amber pharmacy bottle, identical in every way to the ones Mrs. Gable had seen him delivering to my back door in the dead of night. He wasn't just the lover and the architect. He was the supplier. I turned off the camera, the blue light fading to black, and realized that I finally had the physical link between their affair and the toxins that had stopped my son's heart. The camera felt like a live grenade in my pocket. As I descended back into the house, its weight, a physical reminder of the power I now held. I didn't go to the police with the motel photos. I went to the one place that scares a crooked lawyer more than a jail cell, the Colorado Office of Attorney Regulation Council. I retreated to my study, the familiar scent of old bindings and leather grounding me as I prepared to strike. I sat in my high-backed chair, the rhythmic, reassuring tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, keeping time as I utilized my 35 years of paralegal connections. I placed 3 specific calls to retired colleagues who specialized in legal ethics and probate fraud. I shared the details of the forged power of attorney and the suspiciously accurate notarization from Hunter Volos's firm. I knew that in the Denver legal community, a reputation for dirty notarizations was a career killer. "I am not looking for a favor, Frank," I said, into the receiver, my voice steady. "I am looking for a scalpel. Hunter Volos is cutting corners in my living room, and the notary's stamp is his weakest link. If he forged my name, he forged his own ethics. Why fight a war with bullets when you can win it with a well-placed grievance and a phone call to the right clerk?" With Thane Garrison's assistance via a secure line, I filed the formal complaint. I included the digital timestamp from the motel photos showing Volos's lead assistant meeting with Vance Prescott on a day the assistant claimed in court records to be in a deposition across town. This contradiction created a reasonable suspicion of conflict of interest and fraudulent document preparation that the ethics board simply couldn't ignore. I hit the final send button on the laptop, the pale blue light illuminating my face as the filing was officially recorded. If the board freezes his files for an audit, I told Thane, Beatrix loses her shield. Subpoenas. The only thing in this house more lethal than the tea. Later that evening, I stood in the hallway shadows and observed Beatrix receiving a phone call likely from Volos's office. Her face went from its usual mask of feigned serenity to a ghostly, translucent white. Her hand trembled as she listened, the frantic, sharp tapping of her phone against the marble counter echoing like gunfire. I stepped into the light of the kitchen doorway, a cool evening Denver breeze through the cracked window ruffling my hair. "Is everything all right, Beatrix?" I asked, my voice a thin, polite rasp. "You look like you have seen a ghost. Or perhaps a subpoena." She slammed the phone down, the plastic clatter sharp and final. "It is nothing, Arthur. Just a business matter. Go back to your clocks and your dusty books." She was trying to maintain control, but the cracks in her armor were widening. I realized then that my ethics trap had worked perfectly. It wasn't just about stopping Volos, it was about forcing him to withdraw from the case entirely to save his own license. This would leave Beatrix without her high-priced legal architect just weeks before the probate hearing. Furthermore, the inquiry automatically triggered a stay on any property transfers Volos was handling, effectively locking the Highland estate in place, despite the forged documents. Beatrix looked at the hallway where I stood, her eyes glowing with a realization that the confused old man had just cut the legs out from under her entire legal defense. She finally understood that I wasn't her victim. I was her judge. The official summons arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a man who didn't care about the history of the Sterling family. The process server didn't look like a harbinger of doom. He looked like a weary college kid in a faded polo. But the manila envelope he pressed into my hand was the opening bell of a war I had been preparing for since the airport call. He muttered a rehearsed line about me being served and vanished down the porch steps. I felt a chill of calculated calm as I ran my fingers over the dry, parchment-like texture of the legal summons. Beatrix had moved faster than a winter storm in the Rockies, filing a petition to contest Julian's will and bypass the usual 90-day waiting period. She was gunning for an emergency hearing, a desperate attempt to gain legal control before my mind could clear of the chemical fog she was so diligently feeding me. I read the clinical allegations of my own advanced cognitive decline with the detached eye of a man reading a stranger's obituary. I took the heavy envelope to Thane Garrison's office, where the smell of high-end stationery and floor wax always promised a specific kind of orderly justice. We sat in a secure room, the cold glare of the floor-to-ceiling office windows reflecting the steel in my gaze. "She is moving fast because she is bleeding." "Thane," I said, sliding the document across the mahogany table. The ethics complaint against Volos rattled her. Now she's trying to use the law to silence me before the toxicology reports can catch up to her. Thane nodded, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of his fountain pen echoing my own heartbeat. He explained that she was petitioning to be named temporary conservator of my person and estate. It was a play for total dominance. Discovery. In the legal world, it is the process of lifting the rock to see what is crawling underneath. I told Thane that discovery would be our scalpel. We weren't just going to defend. We were going to pull her financial rot into the blinding light of a courtroom. We spent the next 3 hours mapping out the trap. I insisted on a specific list of demands: Beatrix's phone records, the login history for Julian's banking apps, and the identities of the 2 physicians she intended to call as experts on my mental state. As I scrolled through the summons again, I hit a paragraph that made my blood turn to ice. Marigold had signed an affidavit confirming my supposed episodes of violence. They had escalated from simple fraud to character assassination using the girl Julian loved as the primary weapon. How do you defend against a lie that has been signed, sealed, and delivered by your own family? Thane wanted to present the smartphone recordings immediately, but I held up a hand. No, let her lie under oath first. A lie told in court is a permanent record. Once she commits to the fiction, we'll hand them the rope and see if they are smart enough not to tie the knot. We finalized the discovery requests, setting a perimeter around the truth that they would have to cross at their own peril. I signed the documents with a steady hand, knowing that the names of the doctors on her list would be the final nails in a casket she was currently building for herself. I walked out into the Denver sun, surgically focused and colder than the shade of a mountain peak. The house was quiet when I returned, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The Victorian house I built with my own sweat and blood had become a labyrinth of malice where every shadow seemed to hold its breath as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom. I moved with a heavy heart, yet my mind remained as sharp as a surgical blade. When I entered my sanctuary and flicked the light switch, I stopped dead. There, centered perfectly on my pillow, sat a single sheet of typed paper. It was chillingly clinical, A list of actuarial statistics regarding accidental falls in the elderly and the high probability of sudden cardiac events for seniors living in unmonitored environments. It wasn't signed, but the unique blocky font style was a perfect match for the disbarred financial documents I'd reviewed in Vance's past. So we have moved past the tea and onto the blunt threats I whispered to the empty room. You're getting desperate, Beatrix. Desperate people make noise. I didn't let the fear take root. Instead, I felt a surge of cold, analytical resolve. My paralegal training took over as I reached for my smartphone. Fall risk. That's what the paper said. In this house, the only thing falling is the Thorne family's house of cards. I took several high-resolution photos of the note exactly where it lay, the stark white glare of the smartphone flash illuminating the threat. I ensured the metadata captured the exact timestamp and GPS coordinates. Then, using a pair of watchmaker's tweezers from my dresser, I carefully lifted the paper and slid it into a sterile plastic evidence bag. I labeled it Exhibit A and felt the satisfying weight of the plastic in my hand. Every threat is just another line in your indictment, I thought. I moved to the bedroom door and engaged the heavy brass bolt I'd installed years ago. The cold, metallic click offered a temporary illusion of safety. As I sat in my armchair, the weight of my vintage service pistol resting on the side table, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. A faint, cloying smell of sandalwood cologne clung to my pillowcase. Vance had been in this room, standing over my bed, while I was at the law office, violating the one place I thought was still mine. How do you sleep in a room that has been violated by the man who helped kill your son? I sat in the darkness, listening to the house settle. Below me, I could hear the muffled, heavy bass of Marigold's music thudding through the floorboards, and the low, rhythmic murmur of Beatrix's voice as she paced the hallway on her phone. They were confident. They believed the emergency hearing would be my finish line. The storm is here, Julian, I thought, looking toward the window. I hope you're watching. Sleep is for the innocent. Tonight I would settle for silence and a clear sightline to the door. I knew this was the final night I would spend as a victim in this house. Tomorrow the roles would finally flip, and the hunters would find themselves in the trap. I watched the handle of my bedroom door jiggle once-twice in the dead of night, and I realized that they weren't waiting for the court's permission to remove me anymore. The morning sun over Denver was sharp and unforgiving, reflecting off the marble columns of the county courthouse as I made my way toward the entrance. I walked through those corridors not as a retired paralegal visiting old friends, but as a man fighting to keep the very name etched on his birth certificate. I could feel the cold, smooth texture of the wooden gallery rail as I entered courtroom 4B and took my place beside Thane Garrison. I scanned the arena. Beatrix sat at the defense table accompanied by a new high-priced attorney who radiated a slick, polished arrogance. She had clearly hired a cleanup specialist to replace Volos, someone whose job was to pretend the earlier ethics violations never happened. In the back row, Marigold Thorne looked small and pale, her eyes glued to the floor to avoid mine. The room smelled of old paper and expensive cologne underpinned by the sterile scent of floor wax. All rise, the bailiff called, and Judge Morris, a woman in her late 60s with silver-streaked hair and the weary eyes of someone who had seen every possible variation of human greed, presided over the bench with a quiet, terrifying authority. The rhythmic, echoing thump of her gavel signaled the start of my formal erasure. "This is where the lies meet the record, Thane," I whispered. "Make sure they are etched in deep." Beatrix's new attorney opened with a scathing narrative painting me as a tragic figure lost in the fog of advanced dementia. He spoke of my violent outbursts and paranoid delusions regarding Julian's death, presenting the forged power of attorney as a necessary intervention to protect the sterling assets from my own instability. I sat perfectly still, a stone gargoyle in the front row, while the dry, scratchy sound of the court reporter's stenograph recorded every fabrication, marble and oak. It is a beautiful place to watch someone try to bury you while you are still breathing. The opposition called their first medical witness a physician I recognized from Julian's secret recording. He testified with a professional detachment that chilled me, claiming I had failed several cognitive assessments during a home visit that I knew for a fact had never occurred. How many silver pieces does it cost to buy a doctor's soul in the state of Colorado? In my professional opinion, the doctor stated, looking directly at Judge Morris, Arthur Sterling lacks the testamentary capacity to manage his affairs. He cited specific details of my supposed episodes of unpredictable aggression, details that I realized matched Marigold's fabricated affidavit word for word. The medical and family lies were so tightly coordinated, they sounded like a script. I watched the judge's pen move across her notepad, the gravity of the institutional lie being constructed around me feeling like a rising tide. I felt a pang of vindication-hungry dread, but I didn't let it show. The doctor stepped down, looking smugly at his briefcase as he passed our table. Thane leaned in to whisper that it was finally our turn to present. I looked over at Beatrix and saw her allow herself a single triumphant smile. It was the look of a woman who thought she had already won the war. She wouldn't have worn that expression if she had known what was on the smartphone currently sitting in my attorney's pocket, waiting to turn her coordinated testimony into a confession. Thane Garrison stood up his chair, scraping against the floor with a sound like a blade being drawn. He didn't start with a question. He started with a heavy black evidence bag that he placed on the table with a thud that echoed like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. I sat with my hands folded, my posture surgically calm, as I watched the opposition's arrogance begin to fray at the edges. Thane addressed the court with a predatory precision, preemptively citing Colorado Revised Statutes, Section 18-9-303. He reminded Judge Morris that under our state's one-party consent laws, a recording made by a participant is entirely legal and admissible. He established the chain of custody for the device, tracing its journey from a secure airport locker to his firm's vault. Your Honor, my client isn't here to argue opinions, Thane said, his voice resonant and commanding. He is here to play the truth. Beatrix's attorney was on his feet, instantly shouting an objection about unauthenticated, illegal recordings, but the desperation in his tone was unmistakable. Judge Morris raised a hand for silence, her eyes fixated on the black bag. I felt the cold, unforgiving marble floor under my feet as the clerk took the phone and prepared the playback. The courtroom fell into an absolute airless silence. Then the hollow digital hiss of the smartphone filled the chamber. It was the ambient sound of my own kitchen, a domestic backdrop for a monstrous conversation. Beatrix's voice was clear, businesslike, and utterly devoid of the grief she had been wearing like a costume. She described the plan to establish my incapacity through 2 bribed physicians, talking about drugging me until I couldn't find the bathroom. 30 seconds of audio. It was shorter than a commercial, but it was long enough to hang them both. The sociopathic details of the financial theft and the medical manipulation were broadcast to the official records, stripping away every lie they had told under oath. Have you ever heard your own death warrant discussed over a pot of coffee? It's a sound you never quite get out of your teeth. The most chilling moment came when Marigold's voice entered the recording. She wasn't just a passive observer, she was laughing at the idea of me being neutralized. Arthur won't suspect anything, she had said. He just sits in that garage with his watches. I watched the color drain from Beatrix's face until she looked like a statue carved from ice. Marigold was trembling so violently in the back row that the gallery bench creaked, and the sharp, stinging scent of smelling salts from a concerned spectator drifted through the air. Judge Morris leaned forward, her gaze cutting through the petitioner's table like a laser. She overruled the defense's frantic objections with a single sharp word. The recording is admitted, she declared, the rhythmic echoing thud of her gavel punctuation, the end of Beatrix's facade. I suggest the petitioner prepares a very different kind of defense for the continuation. This isn't over, Arthur. Beatrix hissed, her voice a poisonous whisper, but the power had already shifted. The judge immediately adjourned the hearing for a re-evaluation of the evidence, which I knew was a professional courtesy, before contacting the district attorney. Judge Morris slammed her gavel down with a finality that felt like the earth shifting, and as the bailiff approached the petitioner's table, I realized the probate hearing had just become a murder inquiry. The courtroom doors swung open with a heavy groan, and I stepped into the hallway to find my daughter-in-law waiting for me. I didn't even make it to the elevators before the silk mask of the grieving widow was ripped away, replaced by the snarling teeth of a cornered animal. The high-ceilinged marble corridor of the Denver County Courthouse felt vast and indifferent to the wreckage of our family, smelling of floor wax and old heavy justice. Beatrix intercepted me with a sharp, echoing click of her heels against the stone, her eyes bright with a manic, cold fury. She stepped directly into my path, her face inches from mine, and I could feel the desperate heat of her breath against my skin as she hissed her threats. "You think a little piece of digital noise changes anything?" "Arthur," she snarled, her voice a poisonous rasp, "you're an old man with a fading mind. No one will believe a digital ghost over the word of respectable doctors. My legal team will have that recording suppressed before the next sun rises." I stood my ground, feeling the cool, circulating air of the courthouse finally reaching my lungs after the stifling atmosphere of the hearing. The judge just believed it. "Beatrix," I replied, my voice a calm, analytical contrast to her rage. And she was the only one in that room who mattered. "You can hire all the architects you want, but the foundation of your lie is already dust. Marble. It's a very cold surface to stand on when your world is melting." Beatrix shifted her tactics with the fluidity of a seasoned fraudster, her expression softening into a calculated plea for mercy. "Think of Marigold Arthur," she whispered, reaching out as if to touch my arm. "Do you really want her grandfather to be the one who sends her mother to prison? We can still reach an out-of-court settlement. If you misplace that original phone, we can find a way for everyone to move on. Vance is already gone anyway. You've won the house. Isn't that enough?" I looked at her with the clinical detachment I had honed over 35 years of transcribing the desperate pleas of criminals. I knew she was lying about Vance being gone. The morning's camera check had shown him still pinned in my garage, but I didn't correct her. "I'm thinking of Julian," I said, my voice hardening. "And I'm thinking of the 35 years I spent recording people who thought they could negotiate with the truth once they were caught. Have you ever noticed how the loudest people in the world become the quietest once the evidence is read into the record?" I leaned in close, lowering my voice so the passing clerks couldn't hear. "You made one mistake, Beatrix. You assumed that because I was old, I was a beginner. You're a beginner in a room full of experts, and the experts are tired of your noise." I turned my back on her, the rhythmic ding of the elevator arriving, sounding like a bell signaling the end of a round. As I walked away, I saw Marigold watching from the shadows of a massive marble pillar. Her expression wasn't one of anger toward me. It was a look of terrifying realization directed at her mother. I pressed the elevator button and didn't look back, even when Beatrix screamed my name, because I knew the next person she'd be screaming for would be a lawyer who couldn't be bought. The district attorney's office was located in a building that lacked the marble grandeur of the courthouse, but it held a much sharper kind of teeth. I didn't ask for a meeting. I walked into the building and laid Julian's cardiologist emails next to the lab report on the benzodiazepines, like a winning hand in a game they didn't know I was playing. The dry, stale air of the government office felt thick with the humming of fluorescent lights, and the weight of the heavy legal-sized folder in my hand was the only anchor I needed. I was eventually ushered into a small, windowless room to meet Garrett, a 50-year-old senior investigator for the district attorney, with a face like a bulldog and a voice that didn't waste a single syllable. He looked at me through spectacles that seemed to zoom in on my every intention, sipping from a mug of strong, acidic coffee that smelled like a long night on the job. "I'm not here for a civil dispute, Garrett," I said, my voice as cold and analytical as a court transcript. "I'm here because my son was poisoned in his own bed, and I have 31 pages of forensic evidence that proves it." I systematically laid out the physical evidence, the recorded confession from the kitchen, the IP logs linking the insurance fraud to Marigold's laptop, the neighbor's testimony about those amber pharmacy bottles, and finally, the comprehensive audit Claude Wilson had compiled over 3 weeks of investigation. The audit was a masterpiece of cross-referencing bank statements, insurance portal logs, email timestamps, and medical appointment records, all woven together into an airtight narrative. Every transfer, every login, every lie documented with timestamps and screenshots across 31 single-spaced pages. I watched his professional skepticism slowly dissolve as my precision left no room for doubt. "You've done more work in 3 months than most of my detectives do in a year," he muttered, his eyes scanning the lab results that confirmed 15 milligrams of benzodiazepine per serving in the tea sample. I presented the cardiologist's emails where Julian described the metallic taste, the same copper bitterness I'd felt in that herbal tea. I explained the neutralization plan mentioned in the December emails, connecting the financial fraud to the physical decline of both men. The audit showed that the $220,000 insurance policy wasn't just changed, it was weaponized as the endgame of a plan that began 8 months before Julian's death. Emails, reports, logs, 31 pages. I was burying them in a landslide of their own making. He was a healthy, 43-year-old man, and his heart didn't just stop, I told him. It was stopped with premeditation, and I can prove the motive, the means, and the conspiracy. Garrett leaned back, a cold realization crossing his weathered features. He revealed that the bank manager's fraud report had already flagged the estate, but they were waiting for a family member to provide a physical motive. If the toxicology on the tea matches his symptoms, and if we can prove digoxin in the body, we have a capital case. He said, his bulldog face hardening into a look of predatory intent. He produced the paperwork for a court-ordered exhumation and a criminal search warrant for the Highland estate. The house felt different. When I returned that evening, the silence was no longer a secret, but a sentence. I pulled into the driveway and saw the heavy industrial padlock hanging shattered on the garage door, the first physical fracture in a war that had finally moved from the courtroom to the concrete. I didn't panic. I had deliberately left that lock weakened a lure for a predator who was running out of shadows. I stepped out of my car, the cold, gritty feel of the driveway under my shoes, grounding me as I moved toward the open threshold. The interior of the workshop was dark, but the sharp, stinging scent of raw gasoline lunged at me, thick and suffocating. Gasoline. The smell of a man who has run out of lies and started looking for matches. I flicked the light switch, my silhouette cast by the porch light, and found Vance Prescott frantically tearing through Julian's archived boxes. He had a metal bin at his feet and was tossing legal documents into it, his expensive suit jacket discarded on my workbench. "You are a bit late for spring cleaning, Vance," I said, my voice as level and cold as a winter morning. "The judge already has the highlights." Vance spun around, his eyes wide and wild. "You think you are so smart, old man," he hissed, clutching a handful of correspondence. "These papers are just trash now. Once they're ash, your little recording is just hearsay." He lunged toward me, but I stepped back behind the heavy mahogany workbench, leading him deeper into the workshop's interior. The garage wasn't a storage unit anymore. It was a digital lobster trap, and Vance had just crawled right into the center. I gestured toward the vintage wall clock above the lathe. "Smile for the clock, Vance. It has a better memory than I do." I watched the realization hit him as he saw the tiny, blinking blue light inside the clock's casing. I had installed a motion-activated cloud camera weeks ago. Every second of his forced entry, the gasoline, and his desperate attempt to destroy evidence was being uploaded in real time to Thane Garrison's secure server. "I will burn this whole place down with you in it," Vance screamed, reaching for a lighter in his pocket. Before he could strike it, I hit the remote trigger on my keychain. The rhythmic, mechanical whine of the security shutters filled the room as heavy steel slats slammed down over the windows and the main door sealing the perimeter. The garage was now a cage, and I was on the outside. I walked toward the house, the strobe-like flicker of police lights already appearing at the end of the block. "The experts are here, Vance?" I called out over the muffled, panicked pounding of his fists against the steel door, and they brought handcuffs. As the first cruiser screeched to a halt, the blue and red lights reflecting off the metal, I saw Beatrix standing on the porch. Our exterior cameras had already caught her handing Vance the lighter, the final act of complicity. She wasn't screaming or crying. She was staring at the ground as if she could already feel the soil of Julian's grave moving. The beginner had finished the game, and as the officers stepped toward her, I realized that while I had lost a son, I had finally cleared the rot from the house he loved. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a storm, not of peace, but of the heavy, stagnant air left behind when the lies have finally run out of room to hide. The morning after the arrest of Vance Prescott and the containment of Beatrix, the Highland estate felt like a hollowed-out shell. The sun rose over Denver, a pale disk of light that offered no warmth to the foyer where Detective Garrett stood, presenting a new piece of paper that would end the Thorne legacy. He wasn't here for the adults this time. He held a warrant for 19-year-old Marigold Thorne, citing the digital forensic evidence of insurance fraud and her role as a tactical lookout. Beatrix attempted to surge forward, her hair disheveled and her voice cracking as she reverted to her protective mother persona. "She is just a child, Arthur. You can't do this to her," she shrieked, her heavy rhythmic breathing the only sound in the sudden silence. I looked at her with the clinical detachment of a man who had seen too many crime scenes. "She is an adult in the eyes of the law, Beatrix," I replied, my voice a dry rasp. "And she was an expert in the eyes of the bank when she used that laptop to drain Julian's accounts." Vance Prescott's first statement to the police had been a desperate attempt to pin the entire digital theft on his own daughter, a final betrayal that stripped away any remaining pretense of familial loyalty. Marigold didn't scream or fight like her mother. She stood at the base of the stairs, looking at me with a hollow expression that made her appear decades older. She admitted that Vance, the biological father she'd been told was dead, had groomed her into the scheme with promises of a real family and a future free of the debt Julian had purportedly left behind. Handcuffs on a teenager. It is a sound that doesn't belong in a house with this much history, but the cold, clinical click was the only fitting punctuation for her confession. "Julian loved you, Marigold," I said softly. "That is the part your father forgot to mention while he was using you as a digital locksmith. Before I expose the truth behind the hidden file that ended their game, if you are still with me, comment A or B. With one reason, was Marigold a victim of her parents, or a predator herself? Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes to convey the core message. If you prefer strictly factual retellings, you can stop here. Detective Garrett led Marigold toward the squad car, the harsh early morning sun reflecting off the cruiser's roof as they descended the porch steps. With the girl gone and Beatrix restrained, I walked into Marigold's bedroom, which still smelled of stale perfume and adolescent angst. I went straight to the bookshelf and pulled down a thick, heavy textbook. Garrett joined me as I ran my fingers over the rough texture of the spine, finding the hidden seam. It was hollowed out, containing an encrypted drive. This was the final repository of the stolen Cayman funds and the communications between the Step 2 doctors and Vance. "We have it all now," Arthur Garrett muttered. "The circle is closed. How do you mourn a girl who was busy calculating your net worth while you were making her breakfast?" As the forensic unit began their work, I opened the first file on the drive and realized the parasitic rot went even deeper. Marigold had already started a secondary folder to blackmail her own mother. As I watched the tail lights of the police cruiser disappear, I realized that the house was finally empty of the Thornes. But the most dangerous secret was still waiting for me in the one place I hadn't looked: Julian's empty hospital bed. The hospital bed sat in the middle of the guest room, like a monument to a battle that had already been lost. I stood in the center of the room, the air still smelling of antiseptic and stagnant grief, and realized that a master strategist never leaves the weapons in the open, they hide them in plain sight. My son had spent his final weeks in this mechanical cage, and I had been too blinded by my own sorrow to see the steel as a crime scene. I began a forensic examination of the adjustable frame, my fingers tracing the cold metal joints. I discovered that the bed itself had been leased through a shell company owned by Vance Prescott, a detail that allowed them to install monitoring equipment without Julian ever suspecting a thing. I knelt on the floor, my knees popping in the silence, and searched the underside of the frame near the motor housing. My hand brushed against something smooth and unnatural. With a sharp, cold, magnetic clack, I pulled away a small black box. Inside, I found several vials of liquid digoxin and a small leather logbook. I opened it to find Beatrix's neat, looped handwriting, but the content was monstrous. She had been tracking Julian's dosage response with the detached precision of a laboratory technician. Every entry, every milligram recorded exactly how much poison it took to slow my son's heart to a permanent stop. "You weren't just a wife, Beatrix." I whispered, the heavy metallic taste of the air in the silent room suddenly overwhelming. "You were a chemist of death." Digoxin. It is a drug meant to strengthen a failing heart, but in her hands, it was a vice grip designed to squeeze the life out of one. Detective Garrett arrived shortly after, his face like flint, as he handed me a preliminary exhumation report. He confirmed that the tissue samples taken from Julian showed massive lethal levels of digoxin, a medication Julian had never been prescribed. "It is official, Arthur," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Digoxin toxicity. He didn't stand a chance." I felt a surge of vindicated grief wash over me. It wasn't a sudden arrest. It was a slow-motion execution carried out in the dark. I handed the magnetic box and the dosage logbook to Garrett, completing the final pillar of evidence. "This logbook is the smoking gun," Arthur Garrett said, flipping through the pages. "She didn't just kill him. She documented the process for her own records." The dosage log. It wasn't a journal. It was a manual for murder. Garrett explained that the Step 2 physicians were already being rounded up by the medical board and the police. The fortress I had built with Thane had finally held, and the ghost of my son could finally rest with the truth etched into the public record. "Make sure she sees that logbook in the courtroom," I said, my voice holding a surgical finality. "I want her to know she left the receipt." Garrett pocketed the evidence and looked at me with a respect I hadn't seen before. But as he turned to leave, he dropped the final bombshell that shattered my moment of peace. Beatrix wasn't in her room, and the tracker on her car had just gone dark. She had anticipated the collapse and made one final move toward the exit. Under the pressure of the kitchen recording played back to him, Vance finally gave up her location. "She's at the Emerson Street flat," he sobbed, his breathing ragged and desperate. "She has a bug-out bag with $50,000 in cash and a forged passport under the name Elizabeth Vance. She's booked on a midnight flight to the Caymans. Please just tell the DAI cooperated." He admitted that the silver rings weren't just jewelry. They were symbols of a secret marriage they performed in January to ensure his legal claim if she were compromised. He had been planning to betray her from the start, ensuring he was the ultimate beneficiary of the sterling blood money. The DA's office recorded every word, and by the time Vance finished his confession, he had secured himself a plea agreement in exchange for his testimony. Garrett walked back into the observation room and handed me a formal charging document. "Vance Prescott has agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and insurance fraud," he said. In exchange for his cooperation and testimony against Beatrix, the prosecution is recommending 32 years in state prison, with a minimum of 25 years before parole eligibility. He'll be 72 years old before he sees daylight again, your current age, Arthur. I felt no satisfaction in the math, only a grim recognition that justice moved in increments. 32 years. It wasn't enough to bring Julian back, but it was enough to ensure Vance Prescott would spend the majority of his remaining life in a 6 by 8 cell. The man who had poisoned my son with digoxin manipulated his own daughter into financial fraud and tried to incapacitate me with benzodiazepines would die in prison, forgotten by everyone except the system that caged him. I turned away from the glass as Garrett called for backup units to move on the Emerson Street address, the silver key to the Capitol Hill apartment, feeling like a branding iron in my pocket. I realized the chase was reaching its final mile, but the man behind the glass was already a ghost in the eyes of the law. A ghost who had just signed his own epitaph in exchange for a slightly shorter sentence. "Garrett, get the sirens ready," I said, my voice hardening into a surgical edge. "We have a flight to cancel, and I want to be the one who opens that door." I moved toward the exit. My mind already blocks away at the Emerson Street flat, where Beatrix Thorne was waiting for a future that had just been erased by the man she trusted most. 32 years for Vance. Life without parole waiting for Beatrix. The experts were finally closing the trap. The sirens were silent as we pulled onto Emerson Street, the shadows of the Capitol Hill buildings stretching out like fingers reaching for a ghost. I didn't need the silver key to enter the Capitol Hill apartment. The door was already standing ajar, venting the sound of a daughter finally screaming the truth at a mother who had run out of lies. I stepped into the cold, stagnant air of the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the cheap apartment carpet. Marigold Thorne hadn't escaped custody as Beatrix likely assumed. She had been released as part of a cooperation agreement to lead the police directly to this bug-out location. I entered the flat to find a scene of jagged domestic wreckage. Beatrix was frantically stuffing bundles of cash into a leather travel bag, her expensive perfume clashing with the musty smell of the room. Marigold stood in her path, her face pale and etched with soul-crushing despair, holding the second silver ring she had snatched from our kitchen. "He is giving them everything," Mom Marigold cried, her voice cracking. "Vance sold us out before the handcuffs even touched his wrists." Beatrix didn't even look up, her hands trembling as she forced the zipper of the bag. "Move, Marigold. We have 20 minutes before the airport becomes a cage motherhood." In this room, it wasn't a bond. It was a transaction that had just gone into default. Marigold's indoctrination had finally shattered under the weight of the digoxin logbook I'd found. She confronted Beatrix with a raw, bleeding honesty, revealing that while she knew about the tea used to keep Julian manageable, she never realized it was a slow-motion execution. "You made me a killer, Mom." She pleaded, the sound of her heartbreak more piercing than any siren. "You let me bring him the water while you stirred in the poison. Just confess. Tell Arthur the truth, and maybe some part of this can be saved." Beatrix finally stopped, but not to offer comfort. She looked at her daughter with a manic, cold fury. "I did it for us. For your tuition for this life, don't you dare play the saint." Now Marigold's response was a final act of renunciation. She turned to the open window and threw the silver ring, the symbol of the secret marriage between Beatrix and Vance, out into the afternoon sun. I watched the glint of the metal disappear as it fell toward the pavement 4 stories below. Beatrix was a storm that had finally run out of wind, leaving nothing but the wreckage of the lives she had passed through. I stepped into the center of the room, my presence finally pulling their eyes toward the ultimate judge. "It is over, Beatrix," I said, my voice holding an icy finality. "The experts have already weighed your soul, and you are short on every count." She collapsed against the wall, the frantic, wet sound of her sobbing filling the small space. "Arthur, please," she gasped, reaching toward me. For Julian's memory. I looked down at the leather bag that had fallen to the floor. Spilled out next to the bundles of cash was a single plane ticket to Grand Cayman, issued to an Elizabeth Vance. I realized then that the woman who claimed to do everything for her daughter had only one ticket and one passport ready. She had always planned to leave Marigold behind to face the music alone. The single ticket sat on the floor, like a silent indictment of a mother who had never known how to love. The sirens had long faded into the Denver smog, leaving the Highland house with a silence so thick It felt like I was walking through deep water, searching for the one piece of debris that would finally prove how the ship went down. I was surgically calm, but a profound sadness anchored my steps. I returned to the estate alone, drawn to the potting shed, where Beatrix had spent so many of her contemplative hours. The structure smelled of damp earth and cedar, the evening light filtering through dusty windows in an amber glow. I began a systematic search, realizing that a woman who meticulously documented her crimes wouldn't simply throw a weapon away. She would hide it among the tools of life. I found the cruelest irony first. A hollowed-out bag of organic soil Julian had bought for my birthday was tucked at the back of a shelf, serving as a primary stash point. "You loved your perennials, Beatrix," I whispered. "Let's see what else you were growing in the dark." Hidden in plain sight was always your signature. I moved to the rear of the shed, focusing on the floorboards beneath a heavy stone planter of dormant hydrangeas. The cool, heavy weight of the stone was a struggle to shift, but once it was moved, I saw the fracture. I used a crowbar to pry up a loose, splintered board, revealing a small, airtight container. Inside was a vial of concentrated liquid extract. When I opened the lid, a sharp, metallic bitterness wafted out, identical to the toxic tea I had faked drinking. Foxglove. Beautiful, bell-shaped and capable of stopping a heart in its tracks if you know how to squeeze the life out of it. Not soil. Foxglove. Digitalis in its purest form. You were brewing your own natural death right under my nose, and I was too focused on the law to see the garden. I held the container, realizing that Potter's Soil wasn't just a label on her shelves. It was the code name I had seen in the December emails between Vance and Beatrix. It was the step one they had discussed in the recording, the slow, untraceable weakening of Julian's heart, before the clinical step two physicians arrived to finish the job. How many times had I watched her tend these flowers, never realizing she was cultivating a cemetery in our own backyard? The cycle is finally complete, Julian. From the garden to the grave, and now back to me. This isn't just a bottle. It's the final period at the end of their sentence. As I prepared to seal the container in a plastic evidence bag, my fingers brushed against a second, smaller bottle hidden deeper in the cavity. This one bore a handwritten label that stopped my breath, AS Final. It was a confirmation that my own lethal dose had already been prepared, timed for the morning after the hearing. I was meant to be the final loose end they tied off. I held the glass up to the dying light of the Denver sunset and saw a small, etched serial number on the base. It didn't come from a pharmacy or a home brew kit, but from the very laboratory Julian had been investigating before he died. They hadn't just used nature. They had used Julian's own professional world to destroy him. I pulled the plastic evidence bag tight, the crinkle of the plastic sounding like a closing door, knowing that the sterling name was finally being cleansed of the rot she had planted. The walk back to the house felt lighter, as if the ghosts of the Highland estate had finally found their peace. I sat in my favorite rocking chair on the porch, the Potter's Soil bottle weighing down my pocket, and watched the high beams of the police cruisers sweep across the Highland neighborhood like a final curtain call. The evening rain began to fall, the smell of damp earth and fresh-cut grass rising to meet the rhythmic creak of the wooden chair. Beatrix was led out of the front door in handcuffs, the strobe-like flicker of blue and red lights dancing across her face, which had become a mask of ruined ambition. She stopped directly in front of me, her eyes burning with a desperate, toxic fire. "You will die alone in this museum, Arthur?" She spat, her voice a jagged remnant of her former poise. I was the only one who kept this place alive. I didn't stand or shout. I simply looked at her with the weary pity of a man who had seen the end of her story in 100 different case files. I would rather live in a tomb of my own making Beatrix than a palace built on my son's blood. She didn't know that my hand was resting on a hidden lapel mic, recording her final admission of intent for the first-degree murder charge that was already waiting for her. Handcuffs. They make a very specific sound when they are tightened on a person who thought they were above the law. I stood up and walked to the driveway to meet Detective Garrett. I handed him the cereal-coated bottle, the cold, smooth glass feeling like the final key to a massive, complex lock. I explained the connection to the laboratory Julian had been investigating. This closes the loop, Garrett. The lab, the doctors, the Thorne family. It is done. Garrett took the evidence and shook my hand firmly. You are a hell of an expert, Mr. Sterling. Julian would have been proud. I watched them drive away, taking the last of the noise and the rot with them. The house was finally ours again. I walked back inside and began the slow, methodical process of removing the Thorne influence. I stripped the gaudy, redecorated curtains from the windows and began boxing up every trace of the intruders. The house was not a crime scene anymore. It was a blank page, and for the first time in months, I had the only pen. I stood in Julian's study, looking at the collection of vintage watches on the wall. I knew then that I wouldn't sell the estate. I would turn it into a foundation for environmental law in Julian's name, a place where the truth would be protected. Just as I reached for the light switch, I found a letter Julian had mailed to himself, held at the post office and delivered late. It contained the final legal trust documents, making me the sole beneficiary, effectively rendering all of Beatrix's legal maneuvering moot from the start. He had protected me even when he couldn't protect himself. I wound Julian's favorite pocket watch one last time and listened to the steady mechanical ticking of the brass gears. The heartbeat of the house had returned. The Sterling name was finally undeniably free. Later that evening, I stood in the hallway shadows and observed the formal conclusion of the legal war that had consumed my life for 8 months. The sentencing hearing for Beatrix Thorne was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a crisp May morning, and I arrived at the courthouse with Thane Garrison by my side, carrying nothing but the weight of Julian's memory. The morning sun rose over the Highland estate, no longer a spotlight on a crime, but a warm hand on a new beginning. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of the courthouse's brass doors, not out of vanity, but because a man should look his best when he watches the law finally close the ledger on a murder. The heavy, rhythmic sound of my footsteps echoed in the high-ceilinged hall as I made my way to courtroom 4B for the final time. The smell of floor wax and stale air in the sentencing room felt less oppressive today, almost clinical. I sat in the gallery, my posture straight, as Judge Morris prepared to deliver the final verdict. Beatrix Thorne was led in, draped no longer in designer silk, but in the scratchy, synthetic orange of a county jumpsuit. She looked diminished, the predatory light in her eyes replaced by a frantic, hollow desperation. She attempted a last-minute appeal based on ineffective counsel, but the judge dismissed it with a wave of her hand, citing the recorded confession from my front porch as insurmountable evidence. Beatrix Thorne, you didn't just steal money. You stole a man's heartbeat and a father's future, Judge Morris declared, her voice ringing with a cold authority. You poisoned Julian Sterling with digoxin. Over a period of 6 weeks, documented every dose in a logbook, as if he were a laboratory experiment, and then turned your predatory attention to his 72-year-old father with benzodiazepines designed to destroy his mind. This court finds your actions to be among the most calculated and cold-blooded murders this jurisdiction has seen. The sentence is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. I watched Beatrix's face crumble, a mask of ruined ambition sliding into the abyss. Life without parole. In the Highland, that is just another way of saying the end. The bailiffs led her away, her expensive perfume replaced by the industrial smell of despair. After the courtroom emptied, I met Thane Garrison and representatives from the insurance company in a private conference room. The atmosphere was deferential. The corporate lawyers who had once been obstacles were now eager to finalize the redirected payout under Colorado's Slayer rule. Because a murderer cannot profit from their crime. The $220,000 life insurance benefit that Beatrix had fraudulently changed to her name was formally transferred back to Julian's estate, with me as the sole executor and beneficiary. Additionally, the recovered funds from the Cayman accounts, $47,800, and the $87,500 from Julian's savings account, were returned in full. The $50,000 Julian had left in the airport bag, minus the $1,800 I'd paid for the lab analysis, and a portion used for legal retainers, was added to the estate. In total, the settlement recovered over $400,000 in assets, ensuring that Julian's life work and legacy would be protected. We have waived the standard processing period, Mr. Sterling, given the extraordinary circumstances, the lead representative said, sliding a stack of documents toward me. What is the cash value of a son's laughter? The insurance company had a number, but they were off by an infinity. It was never about the money, I told them, my voice holding a stoic triumph, but I will make sure every cent of it burns a hole in the memory of what she tried to do. I signed the final release forms with a hand that didn't tremble, officially ending the legal battle that had begun with a suspicious phone call from an airport baggage handler 8 months ago. Marigold Thorne stood by the marble base of the Lady Justice statue, her shadow long and thin against the white stone. I didn't reach for my car keys. I stood frozen as the girl who had helped drain my son's life force took a step toward me, her eyes devoid of the youthful spark I'd seen when she first arrived at the Highland estate. She looked fragile, stripped of the Thorne arrogance, and she revealed that she had been released into a supervised halfway house program for her cooperation with the district attorney. She wasn't seeking my forgiveness, which was a mercy because I wasn't prepared to give it. Instead, she handed me a small leather-bound notebook. It was Julian's real field journal, the one she had kept hidden from Beatrix, even when her father tried to pin the whole fraud on her. I've renounced her, Arthur. She whispered, her voice barely audible over the Denver traffic. I legally changed my name this morning. I'm Marigold Sterling now. I want to carry the weight of what I helped tarnish. I took the book from her, feeling the coarse, aged texture of the leather. She told me Julian's last recorded words weren't about the pain or the betrayal, but about a memory of me teaching him to fly a kite at Sloan's Lake. Keep the money from your mother's trust, Marigold, I said, looking at the girl who now bore my name. I hope you find a way to earn a life that doesn't require a lawyer. I left her standing in the shadow of justice and drove toward the water. The multi-million-dollar check was still a heavy weight in my pocket, but as I pulled into Sloan's Lake Park, it felt like paper and nothing more. I walked the perimeter, the smell of lake water and evening grass filling my lungs. A kite, a string, some paper, and a gust of wind. It's a fragile thing to hold on to when the world is trying to cut the line. I found the specific spot Julian mentioned, sitting on a weathered bench that overlooked the Denver skyline reflected in the ripples. The experts were wrong. The most important things aren't the ones you can file in a folder. As the sun began to dip behind the Rockies, casting a blinding golden glare across the surface, I finally opened the journal. I read the final entries and felt the air leave my chest. Julian knew. He had realized he was being targeted weeks before the end. He hadn't stayed in the house out of weakness or confusion. He had stayed to gather enough forensic evidence to ensure I would be safe after he was gone. He was the expert, and I was just the one who carried the files to court. Grief is like the lake at sunset. It looks beautiful from a distance, but the water is still cold enough to stop your heart if you fall in. I watched the orange light bleed across the lake and realized that my son's final act wasn't dying. It was winning the war before it even started. The journal mentioned he had planted a secondary war chest, a collection of personal letters to me hidden inside the vintage clock movements in the garage. He had been talking to me all along. I stood up from the bench, the journal tucked under my arm like the final piece of a jigsaw puzzle, and saw a single bright blue kite rising into the Denver sky, exactly where Julian said it would be. The garage smelled of machine oil and memories when I finally turned the key in the lock, not to hide a body of evidence but to recover the soul of my family. The air was thick with the scent of lubricant and old metal, a comforting, honest aroma that signaled the end of the long siege. I moved directly to Julian's vintage 19th century long case clock, a towering mahogany sentinel that had stood silent in the corner of my workshop for months. Using the clue from his journal, I carefully dismantled the housing my fingers, familiar with the oily metallic texture of the gears. Behind the heavy pendulum weights, I discovered a vacuum-sealed packet. Inside were handwritten letters from my son, detailed plans for an environmental advocacy group, and the original deed to a small cabin in Illinois. "You were always better at the long game than me, Julian." I whispered, my voice thick with a cathartic release. A cabin in Illinois. You remembered where we started. The letters revealed that Julian had secretly funneled research funds into a private trust for me years ago, ensuring I would never have to rely on the estate Beatrix was eyeing. He hadn't just been fighting for himself. He had been building a fortress around my future, while his own was being systematically dismantled. Restoring a house is like healing a wound. You have to scrape away the rot before the skin can grow back over the bone. I moved back into the main house, heading straight for the guest room I had dubbed the Blue Room. I spent the afternoon stripping away the clinical gray paint Beatrix had imposed, revealing the warmth beneath. I reinstalled Julian's childhood telescope and the soft blue velvet curtains his mother had chosen decades ago. The fabric felt rich and familiar between my fingers. The room was no longer a crime scene or a hospital wing. It was a sanctuary of the sterling past, bright and open to the Denver skyline. The stars look clearer when you aren't looking through a lens of suspicion, I thought, watching the first constellations appear. Is there anything more honest than the smell of toasted bread and the sound of a house that finally knows its owner is home? By nightfall, I stood in the restored kitchen, the crisp, cool night air coming through the open window. I prepared the Illinois Bun Special, a simple toasted roll with salted butter and wildflower honey. I ate at the island, where I once recorded a conspiracy, but now the only sound was the rhythmic, comforting tick-tock of the long case clock. I found one final note in the packet. Julian had already filed a whistleblower report with the EPA that would bankrupt the laboratory involved in his murder. My legal victory was merely the final hammer in a trap he had set months ago. Simple food for a simple truth. I murmured the sweetness of the honey, a sharp contrast to the bitterness of the past year. I realized that while I am the last sterling, the foundation will ensure that Julian's fight for the earth continues long after my own clock stops. Good night, Julian. The house is quiet and the law is satisfied. I turned off the kitchen light and walked upstairs, the steady, honest heartbeat of the house following me for the first time in months. As the Project 159KV4 folder lay closed on the desk, no longer a case to be solved, but a story finally told. Success in the law is measured in verdicts, but redemption is measured in the depth of the first full breath you take once the courtroom doors are locked behind you for good. I sat in my study one final time, the room smelling of autumn air and old paper, as Thane Garrison placed the charter for the Julian Sterling Foundation for Environmental Justice on the mahogany desk. With a steady hand, I signed the document, officially transferring the recovered Cayman funds and the insurance settlement into a trust that would ensure my son's life work continued long after I was gone. This house was a fortress, Thane, I said, handing over the heavy brass keys to the board members. Now it is a lighthouse. You have left a legacy that even the thorns couldn't poison. He replied, his voice full of a noble satisfaction. I didn't tell him that the Potter's soil bottle wasn't the final strike. Before I even entered the room, I had sent a digital file to the state bar, a video I'd secured of Hunter Volos admitting his role in the conspiracy during a panicked meeting with Beatrix. By the time I crossed the state line, his career would be as dead as his conscience. I performed a final walkthrough of the empty rooms, the floorboards silent beneath my feet. I checked the wall clocks one last time, ensuring their pendulums were stilled. Silence. It used to be a threat in this house. Now it is a benediction. I picked up the single suitcase I had packed. Inside were my watchmaker's tools and Julian's field journal. I left behind the folders, the digital evidence, and the crushing weight of the investigation. The experts have left the building, I whispered to the empty foyer. It is just time now. Real time. I stopped at the front door, and ran my hand over the smooth, worn leather of the Illinois cabin deed Julian had hidden for me. It was a path back to a simpler life, a gift from a son who knew his father better than I had realized. What does a man do once the war is over? He stops counting the bullets and starts counting the stars. I stepped out onto the porch, the air crisp and biting, and locked the front door for the last time. The cold, heavy click of the lock turning felt like the final period at the end of a long, brutal sentence. I handed the key to the foundation representative and walked to my car without looking back. As I pulled onto the highway, the Rocky Mountains began shrinking in my rearview mirror, their jagged peaks surrendering to the vast, open plains. I felt the rhythmic vibration of the tires on the asphalt, a steady, honest song that matched the peace in my chest. "I'm going home, Julian," I murmured. "I am finally going home." Just as I reached for my coffee, I noticed a small envelope tucked into the back of the cabin deed. Inside was a photo Julian had taken years ago of the two of us at Sloan's Lake. On the back, in his precise scientific hand, he had written, "The best expert I ever knew." I turned the car toward the rising sun of the plains, knowing that while I left a house behind, I was carrying the only truth that ever mattered in the seat beside me. When I look back at everything that happened in my life, I realized this family story was never just about money, a house, or even revenge. It was about blindness. I trusted the wrong people, simply because they shared my roof. If there is one thing I want you to learn from my family story, it is this: never let grief or love silence your instincts. When something feels wrong, ask questions before it is too late. Many people call what happened to me a dad revenge story. Maybe it is. But the truth is that dad revenge was never my goal. Justice was. I fought because my son deserved the truth, and because no father should watch his child's life erased by greed. If my journey becomes a family story, people remember, I hope it reminds you that protecting your legacy sometimes means standing alone. Looking back, I also understand something deeper: revenge may start the fight, but truth is what finishes it. That is the real lesson behind this dad revenge path. In the darkest moments when I felt completely lost, I believed God was still guiding my steps, helping me uncover the truth piece by piece. So my advice is simple: do not repeat my mistake. Pay attention to the people around you. Protect your family. Ask the hard questions before the poison reaches the cup. If my experience as a father means anything, let it be this: justice may take time, but it always finds its way home. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Leave a comment and tell me honestly, what would you do if you were in Arthur Sterling's position, discovering the people in your own home were plotting against you? I'd truly value hearing your perspective. If this family story moved you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter of stories like this. And just a gentle note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real-world issues about trust and betrayal, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that might suit you better.